Conscription means basically writing someone's name on a list, but that's not the full meaning of conscription. Conscription, also known as the draft in American English, is the practice of compulsory enlistment in a national service, mainly a military service, enforced by law. Conscription dates back to antiquity and continues in some countries to the present day under various names. The modern system of near-universal national conscription for young men dates to the French Revolution in the 1790s, where it became the basis of a very large and powerful military. Most European nations later copied the system in peacetime, so that men of a certain age would serve 1 to 8 years on active duty and then transfer to a reserve force. Conscription is controversial for a range of reasons, including conscientious objection to military engagements on religious or philosophical grounds, political objection, for example, to service for a disliked government or unpopular war, but mostly conscription is controversial for the same reasons that slavery was. Conscription of young boys into war by rich old men, almost invariably white, has a history as old as historical records. The fuel that drives every war is the blood of young conscripts, always for the exclusive benefit of the old white leader men. Conscription of a poor underclass to serve the financial interests of the rich old leader class is a practice as old as prostitution and money lending, older than the invention of gods to make the worker class supplicants compliant. Long before man created God, the rich old man leader class found ways to force the young, poor and vulnerable into killing at their command for their personal benefit. All societies that prosper today in the rule by rich old white man model of evangelic fascist democracy are founded on the blood of young men conscripted into war. Conscription means basically writing someone's name on a list, but that's not the full meaning of conscription. Conscription, also known as the draft in American English, is the practice of compulsory enlistment in a national service, mainly a military service, enforced by law. Conscription dates back to antiquity and continues in some countries to the present day under various names. The modern system of near-universal national conscription for young men dates to the French Revolution in the 1790s, where it became the basis of a very large and powerful military. Most European nations later copied the system in peacetime, so that men of a certain age would serve 1 to 8 years on active duty and then transfer to a reserve force. Conscription is controversial for a range of reasons, including conscientious objection to military engagements on religious or philosophical grounds, political objection, for example, to service for a disliked government or unpopular war, but mostly conscription is controversial for the same reasons that slavery was. Conscription of young boys into war by rich old men, almost invariably white, has a history as old as historical records. The fuel that drives every war is the blood of young conscripts, always for the exclusive benefit of the old white leader men. Conscription of a poor underclass to serve the financial interests of the rich old leader class is a practice as old as prostitution and money lending, older than the invention of gods to make the worker class supplicants compliant. Long before man created God, the rich old man leader class found ways to force the young, poor, and vulnerable into killing at their command for their personal benefit. All societies that prosper today in the rule by rich old white man model of evangelic fascist democracy are founded on the blood of young men conscripted into war. Consider what it takes to form an army to kill the designated enemies of the state in order to pillage the spoils of victory. Who benefits from this process, where an army of youngsters proceed like automatons, programmed to kill on command, expecting nothing in return other than the opportunity to kill for duty, without expecting a share of the profits their killing generates? That privilege is limited to the rich white old men, the leader class who write the laws that conscript the kids to do their bidding for no higher purpose than creating more wealth for the rich old white men who conscript these young boys using tried and proven methodology involving fear, nationalism, patriotism, and religion. A cycle of serial abuse of youth by the experience of age. From the beginning of social order, where leaders established abundance that attracted the attention of greedy neighbors who raised armies to steal, the need to defend wealth arose. Defense as a national duty took two forms. One was professional, where the strongest, most adept at fighting and killing are recruited into a professional army, indemnified in law, and trained in the art of warfare to respect the rules and laws that evolved as wars consumed the planet. Soon it became apparent that no society could maintain a paid professional standing army all year round, year after year, and still make enough profit for the leader class to enjoy emperor-like lifestyles. This created a demand for indentured servitude. Conscription was born. Why pay a soldier when you can convince a poor kid to do the killing for you at a fraction of the costs? The methodology of how best to conscript is a refined science, starting with slavery, when early on in our species' development, warrior kings supplemented their fighting knights with slaves, often for use as cannon fodder. After the abolition of slavery, a new form of slavery emerged. That is conscription, a process that requires creating a servile, impoverished underclass, then educating them into faith-based compliance, pairing the almighty with the nationalist obligation, to the extent that they volunteer for their own servitude, entering a service whose methodology is to break down the man to create the soldier. Once the soldier awakens, that is the man for life. The most significant factors for recruiting a blind faith follow-command army are age. Preteens are easier to train to follow commands blindly. Educational level, where the least intelligent are easier to train to follow commands blindly. Socioeconomic background, where the poorest are easier to train to follow commands blindly. Religion, where the most religious already submit to blind faith, making it easier to train to follow commands blindly. Race, where existing predisposition to racist loyalty makes it easier to assemble a cohesive group that will follow commands blindly. To convince young men to serve in this personal wealth scheme is not that hard. Getting the majority to feel that they are volunteering in a "your country needs you" World War I model of nationalist indoctrination based on a demonized threat worked on a majority since the start of 20th century wars. In the past 100 years of war and conscription, assembling an army of conscripts usually follows two distinct paths. One is the organized legal prescription that prepares armies for wars within the rules of war, as agreed in the Geneva Conventions. A draft that selects either some or all of the school leaver population. The other is the illegal brand of gang-style terrorist-designated groups, either operating as liberators following invasion by a regulated army, or as mass-murdering criminals seeking opportunities for enrichment. This is more common in third world countries lacking the resources to educate a compliant resource of children trained to volunteer for national service. The first records of formal conscription requiring youth to serve in the military date back to ancient Egypt some 3,000 years ago. That system was simple. Rich, powerful men from the leader class recruited the lowest, poorest layer from the worker class based on size and desperate need, then paid them slave wages to kill on command, often pairing them with slaves to boost the numbers rushing off to defend their wealth. The modern era of near-universal national conscription for young men dates to the French Revolution in the 1790s, where it became the basis of a very large and powerful military, enriching the rich white man leader class with more wealth than any privileged small leader class had ever enjoyed before. That kind of opportunity caught the eye of the rest of the civilized world. Compulsory enlistment in a militarized national service enforced by law caught on like wildfire with every leader class. Most European nations copied the conscription system in peacetime so that men at a certain age would serve 1 to 8 years on active duty and then transfer to the reserve force. Under the feudal laws on the European continent, landowners in the medieval period enforced a system whereby all peasants, freemen, serfs, and noblemen aged 15 to 60 living in the countryside or in urban centres were summoned for military duty when required by either the king or the local lord, bringing along the weapons and armour according to their wealth. For those unwilling to serve the leader class in this way, others of a more supplicant disposition were conscripted to punish their non-compliance, often with brutal death. For as long as there have been organized armies with conscripts invading and oppressing in the guise of defense, there has been organized resistance. Civilians joining coordinated militias providing their own weaponry evolved a successful model of guerrilla warfare to compete with the organized major powers who could afford formal conscription and training of troops. Essential to both models, the formal training available to the major powers and the informal guerrilla tactics of the oppressed, was the need to conscript young boys to train as gunmen. Every government that ever assembled an army understood that young boys will need to be able to shoot to become soldiers. This early training, preparing young boys to become riflemen, was best served by starting them young. Hunting became ever more popular as a method for teaching preteens the art of killing with a gun. All royals in every monarchy that ruled in those glory years when God chose monarchs to run the planet modeled behavior for their subjects by celebrating kill-for-fun hunting. Big game hunting, they called it, in a glamorous, honorable and brave duty that normalized killing for fun with a gun for entire generations of little boys who would then go on to become conscripted soldiers, lining up to shoot and kill for king and country. Learning to shoot and kill became a rite of passage to manhood for entire generations of boys in the British Commonwealth and especially the American colony. For conscripts, the lack of good skills as shooters would decide their military value. Good shooters to the left, bad shooters to the cannon fodder line. If you can't shoot straight, then your value is as a target to take the bullet for the boy who can. In many of the colonial wars, resistance to the oppressor's army would depend on hunters with shooting skills for their successes against overwhelmingly superior numbers. Volunteers in self-regulated militias without any of the benefits of a conventional army, just farmers with their own guns and advanced skills as shooters. In the Anglo-Boer Wars, the Boer farmers, who were all volunteers and experienced distance marksmen, were able to inflict much higher casualties on the red-coat British, who were mostly conscripts with poor shooting skills made worse by their single-shot old-style weapons. In this example that sets out conscription by a powerful conscript-based military and a resistance movement of armed volunteers organizing their own militias, let's look at the facts from a conscript versus volunteer model in a battlefield scenario. The First Anglo-Boer War was fought from 16 December 1880 until 23 March 1881 between the United Kingdom and the Boers of the Transvaal. The British Army was an enormous seasoned force comprising both trained officers and poorly educated, poorly trained conscripts dressed in army uniforms with army-issue guns and bullets, and tried and proven tactics honed in the glory years of the British Empire. Against all odds, the war resulted in a Boer victory and eventual independence of the South African Republic. The Boers, mostly a farmer society, had no regular army. When threatened, the men in a district would form a militia organized into military units called commandos. They would elect officers democratically. Commandos being civilian militia, each man wore what he wished to, usually everyday dark grey, neutral-coloured or earth-tone khaki farming clothes. Each man brought his own weapon, usually a hunting rifle, and his own horses. The average Boer resistance fighter who made up their commandos was a farmer who had spent almost all their working lives in the saddle. Because they had to depend on both their horses and their rifles for their survival, they were skilled hunters and expert marksmen. Most of the Boers had single-shot breech-loading rifles, primarily the .50 Westley Richards, a falling block, single-action breech-loading rifle with accuracy up to 600 yards. As hunters, they had learned to fire from cover, from a prone position, and to make the first shot count, knowing if they missed in the time it took to reload, the game would be long gone. At community gatherings, the Boer communities perfected long gun skills in target shooting competitions, using targets like hen's eggs perched on posts over 100 yards away. The British conscripts, by contrast, had no culture of target practice celebrating the sniper's skill. The British infantry uniforms at that time were red jackets, dark blue trousers with red piping on the side, white pith helmets and pipe-clad equipment, providing a useful target in the brown African landscape. The Highlanders wore the kilt and khaki uniforms. They were a well-seasoned fighting force whose tactics had proven successful in the Second Afghan War. Many of the British soldiers were conscripted from the lowest layer of British society. They were trained in traditional tactics of warfare at that time: march in formation, left, right, and follow orders. The standard British infantry weapon was the Martini Henry single-shot breech-loading rifle with a long sword bayonet attached. The average British soldier was not trained to be a marksman and had little target practice. What shooting training British soldiers had was mainly as a unit firing in volleys on command. Ready, aim, fire was often a 3-minute process of preparation for that enormous group effort that included a loud shouting by the officer commanding to assist the invisible enemy, the prone marksman behind cover 600 yards away, to keep their heads down until the loud boom passed, after which it was open season on the bright red targets. And so this unhappy, dumbed-down band of hot, sweaty British boys marched in formation in the heat of the South African summer, wearing their bright red markings, heading for a Boer target many miles away. Left, right, left, right. The Boer farmers, hidden prone in ideal shooting locations with their advanced sniper skills, must have thought it was unfair on the poor boys being asked to die so hopelessly. Subsequent battles became a proving ground for tactics valuing mobility, stealth, marksmanship, and initiative, while the British emphasized the traditional military values of command, discipline, formation, and synchronized firepower. The outcome was predictable. In almost all of the battles in this war, the British casualties averaged 100 for every Boer killed. The Boers claimed a famous victory over the world's leading superpower, volunteer amateurs against a professional army populated by conscripts. After that lesson in resistance to an oppressive occupier, the British government re-evaluated military tactics. Although this re-evaluation did not address the obvious problems with recruiting conscripts. Conscript recruitment during the build-up to the Second Anglo-Boer War showed that a large percentage of those conscripted did not pass the medical requirements to join the British Army, because they suffered from diseases arising from poverty like malnutrition and subnormal ability to understand commands. When they returned to South Africa 18 years later, in 1899, they came prepared for the guerrilla tactics the Boers would use. They had a game plan, the officers to direct it, and the conscript force to do the dirty work a scorched earth, ethnic cleanse, concentration camp genocide solution required. During the Second Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, the British defeated the Boer guerrillas by operating concentration camps in the South African Republic, Orange Free State, Natal and the Cape Colony, genociding the population with a scorched earth ethnic cleanse to wrap up the win for God, King and Country. In February 1900, Herbert Kitchener, aged 50 at the time, took command of the British forces and implemented the tactics that secured the British victory. This time, the occupying force didn't march in formation in redcoats towards skilled marksmen hidden from sight. Instead, they brought the new advances in military tactics to bear. They built concentration camps. Then they ethnically cleansed the farmland, seizing the women and children to inter them in concentration camps. Then they scorched earth the Boers' farms and livestock, and then they allowed many women and children to die in their concentration camps in a conspiracy to genocide with which they threatened the Boer fighters. Either the Boer guerrillas would surrender, or their wives and children would continue dying in the British concentration camps. The Boer War concentration camp system was the first time a whole nation had been systematically targeted and the first in which entire regions had been depopulated, but not the first where the killers of children were mostly conscripts following orders. Eventually, a total of 45 tented camps were built for Boer internees and 64 additional camps were built for black Africans. The vast majority of Boers who remained in the local camps were women and children, estimated to number around 40,000 by May of 1902, the majority of which were women and children, about half of the total Boer population. The total deaths in camps are officially calculated by British Army records at 27,927. Probably as many as 50% of the Boer population were destroyed in the first genocide of the 20th century. If you locate the British Army list of 45 tented concentration camps, you will see the name of Winburg. Winburg is a small town in the Orange Free State. British Army records show that is where 487 women and children died between 1901 and 1902. In August of 1980, I spent an afternoon walking around Winburg, seeing the sights before showtime at 7 p.m. in the town hall. I was on tour in the Free State as a conscripted guitar player in the South African Army Entertainment Corps, backing legendary Afrikaans singer El Debo. After soundcheck and before our show in Wynberg Town Hall, I went for a walk about this low-income run-down town where the only green park area turned out to be a cemetery. On one side, I saw a few dozen rusty metal crosses, looking neglected as weeds grew all around. I walked through them, noticing they had not been tended in many decades, probably since they went in, which the dates showed was 1899, 1900, or 1901. They read, "For King and Empire," above just name, rank, and serial number, with the date they became deceased. These were the graves of the conscripts, many in their teens, forgotten in death as befits their low-value stature, left to rust in weeds. Later, I would compare these pauper conscript graves to those of the professional aristocratic commanders. For example, Major General Andrew Gilbert Wauchope, CB CMG. Andrew Wauchope was a 53-year-old British Army officer who was killed on 11 December 1899 by a Boer marksman early on in the war at the Battle of Margersfontein. His tomb in the cemetery at Maatjiesfontein is an elaborate marble affair, as befits a leader of stature. As was evident when visiting the Boer War graves, the cost of graves remembering those who served reflect the difference in stature between the lowly conscripts and the aristocratic leaders. Marveling at this insight into war graves on that day as a 19-year-old war historian, I moved to the other side of the Wynberg Cemetery. Chalk and cheese. On the other side of the cemetery, I saw multiple enormous mausoleums standing in pristine, well-maintained green lawn. Expensive marble structures. I read the messages on several, written in Afrikaans, all of which were the same with just the name and children numbers changed. Here lies Aunt Sunny and her 4 children, murdered by the British on this site, 1902. By May of 1902, when the Treaty of Vereniging was signed ending the British genocide, the total number of black South Africans in concentration camps was recorded at 115,700. The total black deaths in the British camps was estimated at a minimum of 14,154. A curiously arbitrary estimate, most easily understood by knowing that British racism meant the details of black numbers they killed was not worth recording. It's quite possible that hundreds of thousands of blacks died at the hands of the British, not worth mentioning in dispatches. Considered by some as the first genocide of the 20th century, British military strategy changed after the Boer War. Conscription changed, and the authority of leaders to act on their own cognizance broadened, accompanied by assured immunity for officers. As global law regulating warfare tightened the opportunities for unregulated mass murder, the need to indemnify officers from possible criminal charges kept pace in British and global legislation. In the American Civil War, conscription was used by both the Union and Confederate armies to refill their troop numbers. The Union introduced the Enrollment Act of 1863, also known as the Civil War Military Draft Act. This required all able-bodied men between the ages of 20 and 45 to register for military service. Men were chosen for service by lottery. To avoid service, men could pay a $300 commutation fee or hire a substitute. The Confederacy introduced the first Confederate Conscription Act in April of 1862, making all white men between the ages of 18 and 35 eligible for military service. The age limit was extended to 45 later in 1862 and then to 50 in 1864. The Confederate Congress passed exemptions to maintain agricultural and industrial production, including the 20 slave law, which allowed one white man per plantation with at least 20 enslaved laborers to be exempt. In the history of war, conscription, and occupation, few conflicts can match the Muslim occupation of Greece for barbarity. The 400-year occupation in which the Ottomans sent both conscripted men as well as hired mercenaries to occupy Greece. Use of paid mercenaries to supplement low-cost conscripts developed alongside the conventional military. Conscripting youth is the cheapest way for a leader class to establish a large army, but often this resource requires some firming up with more experienced killers. When it comes to effective military persecution, sometimes paying trained killers with proven skills is a necessary adjunct to even well-trained conscript forces. Especially during the Ottoman occupation of Greece, mercenary hire became an increasingly significant addendum to conscript-dependent military force. In 1981, I started a 3-month contract as a professional musician, 4 nights a week at the Quirinal Hotel in Hillbrow. If you were a mercenary looking for work in the Angolan border war at that time, the South African Army was the leading recruiter of mercenaries. The Quirinal Hotel in Hillbrow was where mercenaries came to meet the recruiters. Many of both would buy me drinks and chat, giving curious Andrew the chance to hear both sides of the mercenary recruitment story. Interestingly enough, most of the mercenaries I met were seemingly nice people. Trained in the British Army, they could earn more with the skill set they acquired in the British Army training than in any other work opportunity on offer. Unlike conscripts, many of whom were resentful, mercenaries I met seemed to love their work, mostly because it paid so well. None had any qualms about being recruited by the apartheid army. If I had to pick one example to show how mercenary opportunity attracts the very lowest of humanity and invites unspeakable savagery as a consequence, it would be the Muslim Ottomans hiring the so-called Bashi Bazouks to supplement their brutality quotient. This group of Ottoman-hired mercenaries appeared at the end of the 18th century, recruited to fight in Egypt against Napoleon. Their brutal excesses during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78 forced the Ottoman government to abandon their use. A Bashi Bazouk describes one whose head is turned, damaged head, crazy head. These irregular soldiers of the Ottoman army were chiefly enlisted Albanians and Circassians, with some recruits from other ethnic groups of the Ottoman Empire, including slaves from Europe or Africa. Although the Ottoman armies always contained irregular troops, such as mercenaries, as well as regular soldiers, the strain on the Ottoman feudal system, caused mainly by the empire's wide expanse, required a heavier reliance on irregular soldiers. These Bashi Bazouks were armed and maintained by the government, but did not receive pay and did not wear uniforms or distinctive badges. They were motivated and incentivized to fight by expectations of plunder. Essentially, a gang of murdering, savage, rapist thieves given license to take what they could in exchange for eliminating dissent in the Muslim empire. Because of their lack of discipline and regulation by military command, their usefulness was limited to fomenting terror. Bashi Bazouks were brutal killers, notorious for looting and torturing civilians in unspeakably barbaric ways that was the hallmark of their recruitment by the Ottoman command. One example from many atrocities is the Batak massacre of 1876, carried out by thousands of Bashi Bazouks sent to quell a local Bulgarian rebellion. The indiscriminate slaughter of some 5,000 non-combatant civilians at Batak shocked the general public in Western Europe and came to be known in the press as the Bulgarian horrors and the crime of the century. The well-documented behaviors of these subhuman killers is too offensive to even cut and paste in this space. This low point of humanity is instead best remembered for ending that form of conscription. Unpaid mercenaries recruited and enabled by government giving unregulated psycho-killers weapons and opportunity rather than paying the costs of assembling a well-armed militia answerable to the laws of war. Ending this form of mercenary barbarian empowered by the state to kill for pleasure and the reward of rape and pillage returned to the global theatre of atrocity in Palestine following the October 7th Zionist genocide that saw many international brigades, including British, American and French nationals, travel to Palestine to emulate the Bashi bazooks. Zionist genocide mercenary tourists able to earn a paycheck killing children and then return freely to their homes, where Zionist leadership enabled child murderers to avoid any censure. The end of Ottoman rule in Palestine came in 1918, following the defeat of its forces at the Battle of Megiddo by the British. Modern Turkey begins with the foundation of the Republic on 29 October 1923, with Ataturk as its first president. In Turkey, conscription law was introduced in 1919 and has stayed in force since then. The length of service has been successively reduced over time. Between 1919 and 1998, the average length of service was 18 months for non-educated males from 21 to 41 years of age, and 12 months for educated university level. After 2001, it became 6 months for all males regardless of education degree. The educated have more value than the unskilled, who are better bang for that cannon fodder buck. Typically in all armies, the educated are automatically commissioned as officers. By the turn of the 20th century, hiring unpaid, unregulated mercenaries incentivized by the opportunity to rape and pillage fell out of favor. In its place emerged a form of international brigades, traveling mercenaries motivated by an idealistic reward and minimum wage. The Spanish international brigades existed for 2 years, from 1936 until 1938. It is estimated that during the Spanish Civil War there were between 40,000 to 59,000 volunteer conscripts, including some 10,000 who died in combat. Beyond the Spanish Civil War, international brigades is also sometimes used interchangeably with the term Foreign Legion, in reference to military units comprising foreigners who volunteer to fight in the military of another state, often in times of war. Formal regulated conscription took a new turn in 1914 as World War appeared for the first time. Multiple countries, including the United States, the United Kingdom and Canada, introduced mandatory conscription. In 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, the British Army depended on a standing army of professional soldiers supplemented by volunteers. Many volunteered, some even lying about their age in order to serve king and empire. But then, many found themselves in trench warfare following commands by the aristocratic educated leaders. Many realized that war was not what they imagined when responding to the "your country needs you" call. That famous poster of Kitchener with his genocide-stained moustache still fresh from the Boer War atrocities. Famously in the battlefields of World War I, the rich leader class who populated the military leadership did not share in battle alongside the eager volunteers. Typically, the officers would live miles from the front line in occupied chateau luxury, with servants pouring fine wine at gourmet dinners, during which time they were not to be disturbed with news from the front lines. Whatever event happened after 7 p.m. on the front lines would have to wait until the next morning. The officers' dinners could not be disturbed. while boys died miserably in mold-infested boots, cowering in terror at the horrors of wet trench war in which officers routinely ordered young boys to run into machine gun fire and certain death. Many realized this was not the deal when they volunteered. Many realized they had been misled. News of casualties from the front lines showed that Scottish volunteers were dying in far higher numbers than their English friends. The racist leadership would routinely allocate Scottish battalions to charge into the machine guns across the barbed wire no man's land. Lions led by donkeys started with Scottish lions and English donkeys. News of this uncomfortable arrangement where the aristocratic, privately educated officer class demanded the poorest of the worker class serve their monarch by sending boys over the top to certain death while they enjoyed private fine dining and silver service luxury led to a fall in the numbers of 18-year-olds volunteering. Something had to be done to restock the live meat conveyor belt on the way to the abattoir. That something was conscription. Conscription paired with a healthy dose of propagandized lying for king and empire. In 1916, the UK government passed legislation that made all UK citizens soldiers, with the exception of those who were too young, too old, too unfit, or in certain occupations. Conscription was unpopular. Over 200,000 people protested in Trafalgar Square in 1916. Conscientious objectors were sent to prison and work centres, where they were assigned to projects like building reservoirs or roads. Conscription is not an invitation. It is a command with draconian legal consequences for refusal. Later, many of those conscripts had cause to wish they had objected when they realized what was happening and decided to leave the front lines. They found the price for changing your mind about running into heavy machine gun fire was being shot by your own friends in a firing squad. Conscription without consequences would not succeed. Between the beginning of the war in 1914 and the armistice in 1918, 307 British and Commonwealth soldiers were executed by firing squad after court-martials convicted them of cowardice or desertion, the latter charge described in very military language as fleeing in the face of the enemy. 307 times young boys, many of them shaking in a shell-shocked terror that in today's treatment plans would qualify for full cover as PTSD, with those responsible for causing it paying out millions in damages, were lined up against a wall and shot by a firing squad comprising other conscripts, who would now have to live with that traumatic consequence of conscription. Reports of these summary executions of British boys fighting in foreign fields for king and country raised eyebrows in Parliament. "I say, Charles, tell me again why we shot 20 of our own boys yesterday," said the good Lord with one eyebrow raised. The responsible minister in the House of Commons, answering a question from a pacifist regarding the summary execution of shell-shocked traumatized boys, denied that any sentence of death for a military offence had been carried out in France on any member of His Majesty's forces. Then as now, politicians lie about conduct on the battlefield. Then as now, there is no accountability for these deceits. As a result, this behavior continues wherever rich old white men send poorly educated poor boys to die for their war business. Qualified immunity is essential for the leader class operating a conscription model that sends children to kill and die. Qualified immunity that includes no mention of how their conscription model works. The scam of indentured servitude where a highly motivated rich white leader class create a poor and ignorant underclass to nourish their need for new conscripts into their endless wars for the benefit of the few billionaires enriched by the military complex. The United States joined the Great War late, but their impact ended the war quickly in unforeseen circumstances. Along with the first wave of conscripted troops sent to the European theatre, US forces delivered the Fort Riley flu that would start the global pandemic, conveniently renamed as the Spanish flu. One of the first recorded cases of a new deadly influenza virus happened on March 11, 1918, at Fort Riley in Kansas. Overcrowding and unsanitary conditions created a fertile breeding ground for the virus. Within 1 week, 522 men had been admitted to the camp hospital suffering from the same severe influenza. Soon after, while the US forces were mustering in readiness to ship out to the European theatre of war, the Army reported similar outbreaks in Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and California. Navy ships docked at East Coast ports also reported outbreaks of severe influenza and pneumonia among their crews. This deadly new flu seemed to target military personnel and not civilians, so the virus was largely ignored by populist media, more concerned by current affairs such as prohibition, the suffragette movement, and the bloody battles in Europe. And so Wilson made the decision to not disclose the fact he was sending this infected group to the battlefields of Europe. From there, the virus spread fast. The microscopic killer circled the entire globe in 4 months, claiming the lives of more than 21 million people. The United States lost 675,000 people to the Fort Riley virus in 1918. More casualties than in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. The pandemic killed more people by 1919 than the war itself. The coughing illness of troops on all sides in November of 1918 motivated the decision to shut things down and go home. Wilson's decision to send this virus to the front lines of war was vindicated. Biological warfare that affected the German trench troops winning the German surrender, carried by conscripts to infect other conscripts, resulting from decisions made by rich old white men. The Fort Riley flu, or Spanish flu, depending on which account you read, started like any other influenza case, with a sore throat, chills, and fever. Then came the deadly twist. The virus ravaged its victims' lungs. Soon, so many were infected that the entrenched belligerents all agreed enough was enough. They all agreed on a number, 11, Armistice Day, the 11th minute of the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 11/11/11/11. Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, 1913 to 1921, reversed his initial policy of neutrality at the outbreak of World War I in 1917. Wilson told the US voters America should enter the war to make the world safe for democracy. The United States became the world's richest economy around 1890, after the Civil War established the obvious benefits of a military complex testing its product in the field. Wilson knew by 1917 that he controlled the world's largest economy that was built on a military complex, a business that required war for growth. That growth would require men willing to serve the military complex. When volunteer numbers for the honor of dying for the nation's economic prosperity became insufficient, laws were passed to forcibly conscript youth. In 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which required men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register for military service. The age range was later expanded to include men between 18 and 45. The draft had a high success rate, with only about 350,000 men avoiding it. Men who refused to serve could be court-martialed and sentenced to long prison terms. The first wave of troops departing Ground Zero in Fort Riley knew that a deadly and contagious flu outbreak was affecting them, but the Wilson government were not to be deterred. Sending the full might of the largest army the US had ever assembled, along with a conscript carried contagious condition. During World War I, the US mobilized over 4.7 million military personnel and suffered the loss of over 116,000 soldiers. The war saw a dramatic expansion of the US government in an attempt to harness the war effort and a significant increase in the size of the United States Armed Forces, galvanizing growth in the military-industrial complex. There was substantial public opposition to US participation in war, then as now. Possibly as much as 1/3 of Americans were opposed to the culture of war for economic prosperity. Canada was equally enthusiastic about conscription. In 1917, the Military Service Act was passed, making all male citizens between the ages of 20 and 45 subject to military service. The conscription debate was a major issue in the 1917 federal election, which was won by Sir Robert Borden on a pro-conscription ticket. The Patriots wanted conscription, voting for war. More than 650,000 Canadians and Newfoundlanders served in this war. More than 66,000 died. More than 172,000 were wounded. In turn-of-the-century Germany, all able-bodied men aged 17 to 45 were liable for military service. By 1914, the Germans had a well-established and organized system of peacetime conscription. At age 20, men would undertake 2 or 3 years of peacetime training in the active army. At the end of their training, they went back into civilian life, but could be called up to army service at any time, up to the age of 45. Germany's conscription system meant that by August 1914, soon after 19-year-old Serbian class warrior Gavrilo Princip fired that famous bullet from his Browning 1911 9mm pistol, the exact same weapon my father carried through World War II as his sidearm, into the head of rich old white aristocrat Franz Ferdinand, the German army needed just 12 days to expand from 800,000 to 3.5 million soldiers. In 1914, Germany's conscription was shown as the most effective and efficient use of conscription the world had ever seen, paired perfectly with a booming military complex to place the guns and bullets in the hands of the boys who had no say in being sent out to kill and die for their rich old white leader class. In the United Kingdom, military conscription has existed for 2 periods in modern times. The first was from 1916 to 1920, and the second from 1939 to 1960. After World War II, national service as peacetime conscription was formulated by the National Service Act of 1948, introduced by Clement Attlee's Labour government. From the first day of 1949, healthy males 17 to 21 years old were required to serve in the armed forces for 18 months and remain on the reserve list for 4 years. They could be recalled to their units for up to 20 days for no more than 3 occasions during these 4 years. Men were exempt from national service if they worked in one of 3 essential services: coal mining, farming, and the merchant navy, for a period of 8 years. If they quit these roles early, they were subject to being called up. Exemption continued for conscientious objectors with the same tribunal systems and categories. You could object to killing and dying for reasons of conscience. However, the exemption would exceed the time national service took and carry penalties that would last way beyond that. Typically, the system ensured that conscientious objectors would lose their rights to a normal life for refusing conscription. Then, just like that, in 1960, the UK did away with national service. In South Africa, where I grew up, conscription was established in 1967, continuing for 27 years until it was abolished in 1994 via a constitutional amendment. At its peak, conscription in South Africa consisted of 2 years of mandatory military service, followed by camps at intervals. Under apartheid law, the call-up applied to all white men after completing their schooling or further studies. The End Conscription campaign only began in 1983 in opposition to this requirement. For the vast majority in South Africa at this time, the apartheid years, conscription was commonly viewed as the best time of your life you would never want to have again. In the face of opposition by some 10% of the anti-apartheid population, conscription was enforced with draconian punishment. Conscientious objection was never a realistic option. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses who objected to serving on religious grounds were exempt from the 2 years in uniform. Instead, they served 6 years in detention barracks wearing blue overalls. During my 2-year forced conscription in the South African Apartheid Defence Force, I once visited a friend in the Pretoria detention barracks in Voortrekkerhoogte, where I noticed a group of boys in blue overalls shuffling along inside the prison walls. These were that year's crop of Jehovah's Witnesses. I stood in amazement for all of 10 minutes watching a group of some 30 18-year-old boys in blue, wondering what kind of militant Afrikaans Jesus would take away 6 years of their lives at 18 because their Jesus didn't want them killing kids. I couldn't compute the numbers. I was 18 and 2 years seemed interminably long. Imagine spending 6 years of your life from 18 to 24 in jail just because you wouldn't shoot black children and your Jesus agreed that the other Jesus who said you had to kill black children was wrong. It was a mind-boggler that I still haven't fully processed. What was the omniscient Almighty thinking when he told Afrikaans Jesus to send his Christian boys to kill black kids and then make sure any Christians who misunderstood this requirement should spend 6 years in jail, learning their lesson about which Jesus knows best? In 1983, South Africa's National Party government announced plans to extend conscription to white immigrants in the country, not only white South African-born 18-year-olds. The policy was promoted by Magnus Malan, the Minister of Defence in the cabinet of President P.W. Botha, as one of the biggest advances in South Africa is national service. He added that relatives were prepared to sacrifice the husband or the child for their country because they consider it an honor to die for their country. South Africa, like Israel, the other apartheid country that depended on conscripts to enforce and defend apartheid racism, was not the only African territory to conscript youth into the malign intentions of corrupt leaders out to benefit only themselves. The less advanced African countries operating without the resources available to South Africa or Israel didn't bother with any legal process for conscription. Why waste that time and money when you can just kidnap kids and train them to kill before they've developed any ethical compass or even the ability to read and write? The methodology of conscription is the same, be it conscription to the army of a global superpower or a regional warlord. You need to convince kids to kill on command without question and ideally without payment. The Lord's Resistance Army, the LRA, is a Christian-themed organization operating in Central Africa and East Africa, founded by Christian former choir boy Joseph Kony in 1987. Coney's father, Louisi Obol, was a farmer and lay catechist of the Catholic Church, preparing Joseph well for his role as founder and supreme commander of the Lord's Resistance Army. According to the United Nations, the LRA has been responsible for more than 100,000 deaths, the abduction of between 60,000 to 100,000 children who were trained to kill on command, and the displacement of as many as 2.5 million civilians between 1987 and 2012. The group frequently forced children to kill or maim their own families as part of the conscription process, while abducted women and girls often became the wives of LRA leaders, suffering repeated rapes and sexual assaults. It was always God's will. The LRA exploited insufficient national and international presence in remote areas of eastern CAR and northeastern DRC to illicitly traffic natural resources to sustain its operations. Who was going to stop them stealing when there was no army available for this purpose? Once the scale of Coney's Christian-themed offences was reported, charges at the ICC followed. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Joseph Kony and 4 other members of the LRA. One of those was brigade commander within the LRA, Dominic Ongwen. Dominic Ongwen was arrested and handed over to the court in January of 2015. Ongwen, who was himself abducted as a child, was tried by the ICC on 70 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including attacks against the civilian population, murder, rape, sexual slavery, forced marriage, torture and conscription, including the use of children under the age of 15 to participate actively in hostilities. In 2021, the ICC convicted him of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Ongwen is currently serving 25 years in a Danish prison. The ICJ gets a war criminal behind bars, while Bush, Blair, Biden, and a host of others continue to enjoy the immunity that follows legitimized war criminals. This includes, for example, Kitchener, the British lord behind the genocide in South Africa and the policy of executing boys who fell for his "Your country needs you" poster. When considering war crimes in the ICJ, it seems peculiar that Ongwen is one of very few behind bars right now. A black man who was kidnapped as a child and indoctrinated into his role in the LRA. Ongwen was a victim of war crimes, including those of the colonial powers, starting with their theft of Africans, starting with the slave trade. The Europeans who set up trade and settlements in the Americas, beginning with Columbus's voyage in 1492, saw slavery as an indispensable source of labor. African slavery was already part of the social construct and economy of Spain and Portugal and spreading to other parts of Europe. The transatlantic slave trade began in the 15th century. The first voyage carrying enslaved Africans directly from Africa to the Americas likely sailed in 1526. The theft of conflict minerals has been going on for almost as long as the slave trade. Western powers continue to destabilize African efforts to unify leadership by arming and incentivizing criminal gangs with whom to do business. The world powers supply guns and ammunition in exchange for the proceeds of crime from the use of these small arms, knowing that in Africa it only takes small arms and a small team of motivated psycho killers to visit anarchy. From that sponsored anarchy, all manner of deals are done benefiting the companies who trade in African resources, including oil, gold, diamonds, cobalt, lithium. The LRA only exists to exploit demand for illegal mineral resources in Africa, servicing primarily the US market, using the same Jesus that was sold to them in the first place to destroy their societal arrangement between the leader class and the worker class. The story of Dominic Ongwen is interesting for many reasons. Dominic was conscripted by the LRA as he walked to Abili Primary School in Koro, Uganda in 1988, when he was at most 14. Soon after this forced conscription of a child, his parents were both killed. Soon after being kidnapped, the newly orphaned Ongwen tried to escape. When he was caught, he was forced to skin one of his fellow unwilling conscripts alive, a typical initiation ritual for a new conscript. Under Coney's direction, the child Ongwen underwent more initiation ceremonies, which included torture and being forced to watch violent rituals of people being killed. He was indoctrinated under the tutelage of LRA Senior Commander Vincent Oti as an LRA fighter before rising within the ranks to become a major by the age of 18 and a brigadier of the Senior Brigade, one of the 4 LRA brigades, by his late 20s. Ongwen was a member of the Control Alta of the LRA that directs military strategy. Had this minor child not followed the demands placed before him that set him on course for the actions he was found guilty of as an adult, he would have been tortured and killed. How culpable is a child abused in this way for actions arising from his early life abuse? Ongwen's allegiance to the LRA faded as he grew older. Then, in 2013, as the ICC started issuing arrest warrants for LRS principals, the United States offered a $5 million reward for information leading to Ongwen's arrest. In late 2014, Ongwen escaped detention by Joseph Kony for having disobeyed Kony's orders and having refused to answer Kony's radio messages. After escaping from his jailer's camp near Songo in Kafia Kingi, a prime location in the ivory trade that the LRA profited from by selling ivory in exchange for guns, Ongwen came across nomadic cattle herders who handed him over to a Seleka rebel group. The Seleka was a mostly Muslim rebel group who successfully took over the Central African Republic, CAR, installing their leader, Michael Jotodia, as president in March of 2013. Seleka fighters that ushered Jotodia to the presidency then ran wild across the CAR during his time in office, plundering villages and killing Christians as well as supporters of the former president Francois Bozizi. In September of 2013, the very presidential Michael Jotodia announced that Seleka had been dissolved. The disbanded group dispersed into the countryside, where they've been committing mass atrocities, according to Human Rights Watch. Executions, rape and looting by ex-Seleka fighters after the coup and disbanding have fomented religious tension where the population is 80% Christian. Christian militias using the name Anti-Balaka have been formed to fight the Muslim Seleka. In response, the UN considered sending troops to stop the atrocities and established the MINUSCA peacekeeping mission in September of 2014. The Seleka group didn't know who Ongwen was when the newly escaped Kony prisoner found his way to their custody, and so they didn't claim the $5 million bounty before his location was provided to American Special Forces in Obo, CAR. Later, when they realized his identity, they tried claiming the bounty, but the US position was not receptive. Soon after finding himself in the custody of American Special Forces, Ongwen became the only one of the 5 indicted LRA war criminals to face justice. The only one of the 5 who learned his war criminal skills as a conscripted minor child under duress. The first legal case against Ongwen was in 2005. Brigade commander of the Senior Brigade of the Lord's Resistance Army, the LRA. 11 years later, Ongwen finally faced the judge at the ICC in March of 2016, when the ICC confirmed 70 charges brought against him and committed him to trial. Ongwen denied all the charges against him. The prosecutor versus Dominic Ongwen lasted almost 4 years, from 6 December 2016 to 12 March 2020. 4,107 victims were granted the right to participate in the proceedings, though most chose to participate through legal representation. The case brought much evidence to light that benefits our awareness of conscripts' liability in international law. During his time with the LRA, the Catholic Ongwen had multiple wives, including number 1, Jennifer, number 2, Santa, Mintata, number 3, Margaret, number 4, Florence Ayot, number 5, Agnes Aber, also known as Min Ayari, number 6, Fatuma, and number 7, Nancy Abbott. It was in 1993 that wife number 4, Florence Ayot, herself an abductee, was transferred to Ongwen after her own husband died. Ongwen had fathered at least 11 children, 4 of them with Florence Ayot. During his detention by the ICC, Ongwen was visited by family members. He became father to another child following the visit of one of his wives. He's been visited by 4 Acholi leaders, including the paramount chief, His Highness David Onen Achana II. The Acholi were estimated to number 2.3 million people living in northern Uganda and South Sudan. Another visitor to the ICC prisoner Ongwen was the Archbishop of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Gulu, John Baptist Adama, a Ugandan Roman Catholic priest who serves as the Metropolitan Archbishop of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Gulu in Uganda since January of 1999. During this priestly visit, Ongwen asked the Archbishop for a rosary, a hymn book, and a prayer book. Ongwen's case is unique because he was abducted by the LRA as a minor and forced on pain of death to be a child soldier before rising to leadership. So this is the first ICC case in which an inductee is being charged with the same crimes as those done to him. According to one commentator, in no other ICC trial have case narratives been so opposite, morally complex, and riddled with paradoxes. Paradoxically, a victim of colonial war crimes in Africa was on trial at the ICC, while not one of the colonial war criminals who caused his misfortune have ever been. Ongwen is black and poor and born in Africa. In one final cynical twist, on February 28, 2024, Trial Chamber 9 of the ICC delivered in a public hearing its order on reparations to victims in the case of the prosecutor versus Dominic Ongwen. The Chamber set the financial liability reparation due from Mr. Ongwen to €52.5 million and ordered collective community-based reparations focused on rehabilitation and symbolic satisfaction measures. Knowing that this guy is as broke as a guy with 7 wives, about 20 children, and no income or assets could possibly be, the ICC still spent millions preparing a case for reparations, knowing this was only symbolic. Perhaps, if they thought reparations should be paid, they should have calculated the costs of this reparations hearing and donated that money in an actual meaningful contribution towards the victims of the LRA, one of whom is Dominic Ongwen. While the ICC was issuing this enormously symbolic award against broke-ass Catholic Ongwen serving 25 years in a Norwegian jail, at least 1 million war criminals of far greater stature and liability than Ongwen remain free to continue committing their war crimes. Ongwen's forced conscription in 1988 changed how leaders operated conscription methodology and how the international courts processed war crimes. Global post-war changes in conscription. The requirements of conscription methodology changed as almost every country did away with national service, unless they were at war, like South Africa and Israel. The Russian Federation has had a conscription army since 1918. In recent years, approximately 400,000 young men between the ages of 18 and 27 are drafted each year to serve in the military. A 12-month draft for all male citizens who are between 18 and 30 years old, with a number of exceptions. Avoiding the draft is a felony under Russian criminal code and is punishable by up to 26 months of imprisonment. After the end of Nazism on April 30, 1945, Germany returned to conscription. Between 1956 and 2011, Germany conscripted men to mandatory military service. In 2010, the German Minister of Defense recommended Germany end conscription effective from July 1st, 2011. Greece, the Hellenic Republic, has had mandatory military service conscription since 1914. 12 months in the Army, Navy and Air Force for men between the age of 19 to 45. Citizens discharged from active service are normally placed in the reserve and are subject to periodic recall of 1 to 10 days at irregular intervals. This applies to all Greek citizens, as I found out when I arrived for a holiday in Greece in 1987. I was 26, resident in England. As I went through customs at the airport, the official looked at my Greek passport, looked at me, looked at his screen and said, "Come with me." I was detained because when he ran my passport through the border scanner, it flagged me as a Greek citizen who had not done national service. "Why didn't you do your service?" he asked. "Because I don't live in Greece," I answered truthfully. "I live in England. Can I go now? My wife is waiting for me to catch the flight." "You are going nowhere. Police will escort you to the nearest army office and you can start your service now." "How long will that be?" I asked, not really worried because I sensed he was either joking or being dramatic. 12 months. This young official, younger than I was incensed that I had not done my national service. Greece has a hardline approach to national service. Fortunately, I learned from that encounter with military authority that my 2 years of training in the apartheid army prepared me well for manipulating subordinates. After 2 hours in that brightly lit back room, in which I had the opportunity to meet the senior military officials at Athens airport, they agreed that my 2-year conscription in the South African Defence Force qualified me for exemption in Greece. Had I not had the means to stand up for myself in refusing the orders to hand myself in for national service, who knows what might have happened. France, where modern-era mass conscription began, depending on conscription for their many colonial atrocities, suspended peacetime military conscription in 1996. President Jacques Chirac's government formally announced the end of compulsory military service in 2001. Young people are still required, however, to register for possible obligatory service of an unspecified nature should the need arise. A recent change is that women must now register as well. Conscription in the United Arab Emirates is a mandatory national military service for all Emirati males aged between 17 and 30 for the duration of 11 months. The law is intended to bolster the United Arab Emirates' defense capabilities and increase the military reserve force of the UAE armed forces. In South Korea, conscription typically lasts between 18 and 21 months for most able-bodied men. Exemption is difficult. Women are not required to perform military service, but they may voluntarily join the military. Since the Zionist occupation gave birth to the State of Israel in 1948, fixed-term military service has been compulsory for Israelis. The draft laws of the Israel Defense Forces only apply to Jews, males and females, Druze, males only, and Circassians, males only, because the Druze and Circassian communities are less populous. There are about 143,000 Druze in Israel and the Golan Heights. There are fewer than 5,000 Circassians in Israel. Circassians are a branch of the Circassian diaspora formed as a consequence of the 19th century Circassian genocide carried out by the Russian Empire during the Russo-Circassian War. Most Circassians in Israel are Muslim. Their women are exempted from mandatory service altogether. Women from the Jewish community are not exempted, but serve for slightly shorter terms than their male counterparts. The IDF does not conscript non-Druze Arab citizens of Israel, though their men and women may enlist voluntarily. Unique among the country's Jewish majority population are the Orthodox Haredi Jews, who previously enjoyed full exemption from the IDF through a special religious exemption organized by Israel's founding Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, in a trade-off for allowing the Zionists to conflate Judaism with Zionism. Their non-participation and frequent opposition to the Zionist state became increasingly controversial in Israeli society, with growing discontent toward the increasingly populous Haredi community not sharing the burden of national duty. In June of 2024, after 8 months of prosecuting genocide had depleted IGF manpower, Israel's Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Haredi Jews were eligible for compulsory service, ending nearly 8 decades of exemption. The army began drafting Haredi men the following month. Over the summer, the IDF Personnel Directorate sent out 3,000 draft orders to Haredi men aged 18 to 26. Out of those 3,000 men, only around 10% have been drafted into the military. Those who ignored multiple draft orders will be prevented from leaving the country and may face arrest by military police and be taken to military jails. So far, some 900 no-exit orders have been issued. Improving conscripts' performance. During the American Civil War, opiates were the most effective painkillers available to military surgeons. They were also used to treat diarrhea, muscle spasms of amputees, gangrene, dysentery, inflammation from gunshot wounds, and to sedate agitated troops. The Union Army requisitioned as many as 10 million opium pills throughout the war and a further 2.8 million ounces of opiate preparation, such as laudanum. Many veterans of the war developed opiate addictions. Opiate addiction became known as soldier's disease and army disease, although the precise effect of the American Civil War on the overall prevalence of opiate addiction is unknown. During World War I, morphine was commonly used to treat injuries. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers developed severe opiate addictions. Since the beginning of conscription and the military training of young people, the leader class have striven to improve performance in battle conditions by both their voluntary professional recruits as well as their conscripts. World War I saw extensive use of cocaine amongst militaries, used for medical purposes and as a performance enhancer. Cocaine was not at that time a controlled substance and was made readily available to troops. The British Army distributed cocaine-containing pills under tabloids brand name Forced March, which were advertised to suppress appetite and increase endurance. Before the war, cocaine was a common ingredient in medicines and tonics for hay fever, as it cleanses the respiratory tract by reducing swelling of the mucosa and nasal discharge. Until 1916, you could buy cocaine and heroin over the counter in Harrods. Shop assistants might have suggested rhino's hay fever and catarrh remedy, basically pure cocaine, for when the nose is stuffed up, red and sore. After a refreshing hit of rhinos, stuffy nose would seem so much less so. The British Burroughs Wellcome and Company manufactured tabloid cocaine tablets were marketed as perfect for singers and public speakers longing to improve their voices. Overall, mass-produced cocaine, which was believed to be as harmless as tobacco, had become widespread well before the war, and soldiers were a minority of its users. After some instances of abuse by soldiers unfamiliar with good cocaine habits, moral panic ensued. The British Army Council passed an order in 1916 that prohibited the unauthorized sale of psychoactive drugs like cocaine and opiates to service members. That, though, was not the end for militarized pharmaceuticals. Often, war requires periods of enormous stamina, like, for example, the World War II bomber crews conducting raids in Germany, flying for some 8 hours or more at night, facing difficult conditions. Day after day, seems only sensible to assist their ability to remain awake and alert. Increasingly so in World War II, amphetamines were given to troops to increase alertness. They had the added benefits of being anorectic, reducing appetites, and combating fatigue. Nazi Germany, in particular, embraced amphetamines during World War II. From April to July 1940, German service members on the Western Front received more than 35 million methamphetamine pills. Germany's big pharma industry loved war. Author Norman Ohler's book Blitzed explores the records of Hitler's personal physician Theodor Morell on his medical treatment of the Führer. We learn that from July 1943 to January 1945, Hitler received regular injections of Eucadel, a painkiller and cough medicine with doses reaching 20 milligrams in 1944. Consisting of an opioid called oxycodone, Eucadel is a near cousin of heroin. While methamphetamine works as a potent central nervous system stimulant, Eucadel's effects are narcotic and euphoric. In June of 1944, after an assassination scare, Hitler was administered a 10% cocaine solution by a laryngologist, Dr. Erwin Gissing, for 75 days. So at least from July to October 1944, Hitler was high on a powerful speedball of opiate and cocaine. During the war, the Führer received a weekly array of dozens of varieties of drugs, amounting to 120 to 150 tablets and 8 to 10 injections every week. In 1944, German army chemists produced the famous DIX, a methamphetamine-based performance enhancer. The researcher who rediscovered this project, Wolf Kemper, said, "The aim was to use DIX to redefine the limits of human endurance." One dose contained 5 milligrams of oxycodone, brand name Eucadel, an analgesic opioid, 5 milligrams of cocaine, and 3 milligrams of methamphetamine, brand name Pervitin. The DIX compound was reportedly tested on prisoners at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp that found an individual who had consumed the compound could march 90 kilometers a day without rest, carrying 20 kilograms of equipment. Nazi doctors and military authorities testing the compound were enthusiastic about the results, but the war ended before DIX compound could be mass-produced and distributed. More commonly, high doses of pure cocaine ranging from 50 to 100 milligrams were tried and proven methods for getting the best out of fighting men. Mind-altering drugs can make soldiers intoxicated and dependent, especially when paired with ideology and charismatic leadership. This combination of intoxicants, ideology, and personality informs Oehler's interpretation of Nazi Germany. The Nazis, who officially pursued a stringent and repressive anti-narcotic policy, hated drugs because they wanted to be like a drug themselves, seeking to create a state of collective ecstasy. In reality, however, social intoxication went hand in hand with turning a blind eye to Pervitin fever, as the stimulant allowed the individual to function in the dictatorship, National Socialism in pill form. Many Germans became dependent on a disastrous cocktail of propaganda and pharmaceutical substances, setting the tone for just about every army that ever followed. During World War II, the German military was the first to introduce deliberate military doping, but others soon followed. The British used in all about 72 million benzodrine amphetamine tablets, and Americans between 250 and 500 million. Although in the last years of the war Hitler behaved like a speedball junkie, he was not the only pharmacologically assisted political leader. Winston Churchill habitually used benzodrine paired with his prodigious alcohol intake. The pervasive civilian consumption of amphetamine, which at the time was not perceived as a harmful nor illicit substance, was recorded in most of the World War II belligerent countries, including Germany, Britain, the United States, and Japan, that continued long after the war was over. Today, performance drugs still assist some fighters, militias, and armies. On the other side of the military coin, the designated terrorist groups looking to get the best out of their conscripts, drugs play a major role, not only for the performance enhancement in the battlefield, but also as a source of revenue. The Taliban and various offshoot groups like the American-funded Al-Qaeda took advantage of the poppy availability to generate heroin revenue. The best-known example of a performance enhancer that is also a lucrative revenue generator for anti-NATO militias is Captagon. Captagon was first manufactured in the US in 1961 as an alternative to amphetamine and methamphetamine used at the time to treat narcolepsy, fatigue, and the behavioral disorder minimal brain dysfunction. Dexamphetamine was already being used by the military to enable soldiers to stay awake for long periods of time and to enhance courage and bravado. Captagon was supposed to be a milder version of these medicines, but by the 1980s, the US government declared it a controlled substance with no currently accepted medical use. Manufacturing of the drug ceased in the 1980s. However, illegal manufacture of this American-owned chemical formula has continued and escalated in the past few years in Europe and the Middle East, especially in Syria. Captagon is a popular recreational drug as well, creating a lucrative market for Captagon producers. The Captagon used by ISIS and other jihadist groups to enhance their soldiers' abilities is far removed from the Captagon of the 80s. Instead of just two main ingredients, manufacturing combines other addictive stimulants with compounding actions into the chemical structure. This refined Captagon is intended to cause irreversible changes in brain circuitry that govern impulse control and judgment, affecting a user's ability to reason or think rationally. Ideal for street fighting to the death, or even providing focus for a second thoughts suicide bomber, for keeping sight of the one and only truth. Captagon, phenethylene, has played a role in the Syrian civil war, where the Captagon business generates revenues that fund the purchase of weapons, as well as aiding the effectiveness of blind faith fighters by retarding their ability to think clearly. Based on 2023 estimates, about 80% of Captagon is produced in Syria and exported from the port of Latakia, with the assistance of the Syrian government under the command of Maher al-Assad. The illicit global market for Captagon, estimated in 2023 to be worth approximately $57 billion by the phenethylene Wikipedia page. Since the fall of the Assad regime in 2024, the new Syrian transitional government claims it will end the drug trade. What about conscription in the Islamic countries? How does it differ to Christian armies? Do Islamic State groups routinely target children for the ease of opportunity that we know children present for use as soldiers? Iran and Iraq both used children in their war, 1980 to 1988. In Syria, the groundwork for the violent ideological indoctrination of children predates ISIS and its mother organization, Al-Qaeda. During Syria's military occupation of Lebanon on November 27, 1985, a high school teenage student drove a car carrying 280 kilograms of explosives into the South Lebanon Army's base, killing at least 20 Israeli and Lebanese forces. Hamida Mustafa al-Tahir, born in Syria in 1968, carried out the suicide attack. In her death, al-Tahir became a national hero. Schools, parks, youth Ba'athist centers, and numerous events were named after her. Al-Tahir's purported heroism is still being used in primary school curriculums to encourage Syrian youth into Ba'athist ideology. The indoctrination of Syrian children in the pre-Civil War context has not been reported much. Like Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein's lion cubs in Iraq, the Syrian Ba'athist branch had its version, Ashbal, lion cubs. Al-Assad, the last name of Syria's ruling family, the name also translates as lion. Through the Ba'athist education establishment, al-Assad's lion cubs received political indoctrination and basic combat training. Ba'athist indoctrination and militarization of youth was, in the case of Iraq, and is still, in the case of Syria, embedded in the education system. There are similarities between the Iraqi Ba'athist system, its legacy, and the insurgency in outlining the historical basis for ISIS' use of children. Use of children in military conscription has consequences for society. According to figures available from the UK Office of National Statistics, National Service conscripts from the post-World War II period were more likely than the general population to be involved in crime, especially violent crime, and to have drug and alcohol dependencies. They were also more likely to have long periods of unemployment and to suffer from mental illnesses than those who were not conscripted. Conscription is a form of slavery, indentured servitude. Trauma is a constant side effect of conscription. My own experience of conscription, 2 years spent training to kill black children for apartheid's right to defend itself, was a traumatic abuse requiring decades of mindfulness to process into some form of order. My experience of avoiding conscription introduced me to many of like mind. This included those who preferred suicide to killing others on command. The incidence of suicide among conscripts is, as you would expect, high. The incidence of suicide in later life arising from the traumatic stress of conscription is far higher than suicide during conscription. At this time, the highest incidence of suicide among conscripts is where you would expect it to be. Israel's military is mostly conscripts. Those who object to being conscripted into a genocide army during an act of genocide are, as you would expect, dealt with harshly by the leader class. The Israeli military reported that at least 28 soldiers are suspected to have died by suicide since the American-sponsored event of October 2023. A military statement said 17 soldiers were killed in suspected suicides in 2024, higher than 2023, when 17 soldiers were killed in suspected suicides, including 7 after the outbreak of war. According to figures released by the Zionist Army in January 2025, at least 891 occupation soldiers have been killed and 5,569 others injured since the outbreak of the Biden-Netanyahu genocide. While most Israelis are very much pro-genocide, some are not. In May of 2024, Pew data found 39% of Israelis say Israel's military response against Hamas in Gaza has been just about right, while 34% say it has not gone far enough, and 19% think it has gone too far. The refuser movement in Israel is a patchwork of individuals, networks, and more formal groups, some organized around specific military units and conflicts, others centering their broader political perspective, typically on the left. Although military service is often described as a national duty in Israel, conscription is in fact far from universal. As little as 50% of Israeli citizens actually enlist, according to left-leaning Mesavot, Hebrew for I refuse, a network of Israeli refusers. Refusing to serve carries a weighty penalty, as you would expect. Other Israeli Jews avoid conscription through medical exemptions or fail to serve their full 2 to 3 year deployments due to physical or psychological conditions. Others simply opt for months-long prison sentences rather than years-long deployments in order to get back to their private lives sooner. Among reservists who have completed their initial deployment but remain eligible for redeployment until the age of 40, the numbers who serve are as little as 2% of the population. Many leave occupied Palestine to avoid serving. Despite such widespread avoidance of conscription, public opposition is relatively rare. In addition to the months-long prison sentences that can be renewed to years by Israeli military authorities, there is the more punishing fear of social ostracization by Israeli society, which is generally militaristic. The girls in Tel Aviv, who reward the boys posting pictures of their abuses of Palestinian women, are less interested in rewarding refusers with their sexual favors. That said, some draft resistors, especially those from left-leaning backgrounds, describe being supported by their immediate family, friends, and other community members, including employers. Nevertheless, fear persists, as you would expect. Since October 7, 2023, only a dozen inductees like Behar Tzalek have publicly refused to enlist, along with a few hundred reservists. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, the Israeli military had 30% more reservists volunteer for redeployment than it had actually called up, according to Yesh Gvul, Hebrew for there is a limit, a more centrist organization which supports Israeli refusers. But as the ongoing genocide in Gaza revealed its true purpose, reservists like Yuval Green, a medic and member of Yesh Gvul, questioned whether they were rescuing the 240 Israeli hostages captured by Palestinian militants or exacting revenge for the 1,200 Israelis killed on October 7. As of this writing, the toll of the genocide, obscured by the ongoing Israeli attacks and blockade, may top 300,000 deaths, according to estimates published in The Guardian. Nearly 70% of the dead who have been identified so far were women and children, according to the United Nations. The majority of those deaths were caused by conscripts or reservists, many of whom are 18 years old, not yet of an age where they can fully understand either the methodology of propaganda that makes them believe killing babies is an acceptable behavior or one they will never regret, exposing them to suicidal thoughts. The death toll of Israelis in years to come will reflect the horrors these indoctrinated kids have been convinced to carry out. After you rape a hostage to death and feel that rush of power knowing you have achieved this life ambition before the age of 20, the rest of your life is a countdown. The same after you pull off the famous double tap in a baby's heart cavity. The adrenaline of knowing you were that good at sniping while still in your teens wears off. The memory of that shot never will. Each replay carries a variant of how great you felt at that time and how much you would like to enjoy that rush again. Nothing beats the thrill of seeing that second 5.56mm round hit the smallest of bull's eyes, the baby's heart cavity exposed by the first round you placed perfectly, knowing you did your job as well as anyone ever could, because it takes a skilled operator and a dedicated soldier to master that specific skill, the baby heart double tap. Then, years later, how can you revisit that kill thrill? Once all the Palestinian babies are gone, what if you find it becomes illegal to snipe babies with the heart double tap? What if people stop patting you on the back with congratulations and start looking at you as if sniping a baby in the heart twice is not a matter for national pride and civic duty? Very few humans can survive living with the reality of what they have done after committing premeditated child murder multiple times. There are many documented cases of the PTSD effects of death camp workers and Nazi executioners ending their own lives, unable to continue under the weight of knowing what they have done in the name of nationalism, religion, or personal pleasure. Killing babies is deviant behavior. Deviance finds its own level through the stages of life. The ghosts of those dead babies live on in the subconscious of their killers. The only way to release them is the only way. If not today, tomorrow, or the day after that, the month after that, or even the year after that. Knowing that you are conscripting boys into a lifetime condemned to adjust to the weight of being what conscription made you, is it worth knowing more about who legislated for conscription? The leader class who made conscription law, especially in occupied Palestine, the so-called IDF, that is the rebranded collection of the volunteer terrorist cells, the Haganah, Ergunsvailumi, Lehi, and so on. The original terror groups who drove the ethnic cleanse genocide in 1948 and called it a war of liberation, very quickly rebranded as a defense force once they had completed their claim to statehood by terrorism, who then indoctrinated the first generation born in occupied Palestine into compulsory military service. Perhaps incorporating these terror cells into a national unit called the Israeli Terrorist Force, ITF, wouldn't have had the same effect at the United Nations. Conscription not only serves the nation's need for more young men willing to kill children on command for 2 years of indentured servitude, more sinisterly, conscription into a deviant cause prepares young people for a life of compliance as serving members of a killer gang. Once you've killed in cold blood, you join a code of compliance. This aspect of Israeli culture, in which all Jewish Israelis of both sexes serve at least 2 years learning to kill Palestinians as a rite of passage to citizenship, defines the state of Israel today, for the 76th year since conscription began. And that's almost all I have to say about conscription. In my view, conscription as legal obligation is the worst crime the rich white leader class ever committed, ruining so many lives as a result. My conclusion as a former conscript and as the author of a book about conscription that I'm told has been useful to doctors in South Africa treating PTSD-affected soldiers from that 33-year war for apartheid, the Angolan border war, is this. We know who passed these laws, and we know what these laws did. We know cause and we know effect. Forcing young people into an ideology that makes child murder not just their civic duty, but their legal obligation, ends their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as ordinary human beings who are not seasoned baby murderers. A condition that once visited never washes away. A Nuremberg show trial starring the best-known leader-class advocates who manipulated their opportunities as leaders to force conscription on children would go some way to raising awareness of just how odious conscription is. Nowhere more so than in occupied Palestine, where 18-year-old boys are trained from birth to believe they have the right to shoot babies in the heart twice and call that their national service.